Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that says it's my Christmas party and I'll lie if I want to. How are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Patrons can listen to more in our bonus episode, but I'm currently at home because I have coronavirus. I'm okay. It's mild symptoms because I'm triple vaxxed, but I probably won't touch too more on it. The only weird thing is I cannot smell anything. So I took yesterday I ate a whole banana, a thing I do not like and do not eat because I could not taste it. So that's kind of where I am. But able to record, able to edit because I have nowhere to go for the next 8 days, I think now. But yes, I'm stuck inside until I am free and the symptoms have gone away. Ready to record, ready to dive into what I think looks like, just a heads up to people, this might be a bit of a longer episode, slightly different episode, because we have missed a few kind of normal recording dates because we've both been fairly busy and unfortunately have just missed some recording dates we would normally have. So we're going to catch up on all the things that have happened in the news. So if you've got an app that supports podcast chapters, they'll be in there as always, so you can jump around if there's things you really want to hear us talk about. But we're going to run straight into the polls, I think, to kind of paint an overview of where things are in the UK. I guess I'll do my usual kind of summary of the polls. I look at November, so let's just November 2nd. Conservatives 38%, Labour 35%, Lib Dems 9%, Greens 6%, SNP 4%. Don't really need to worry about the Brexit parties down the bottom anymore. That's kind of the picture we've had. We've had this kind of gap of 3 to X% between Conservatives and Labour consistently throughout 2021. Ever since we had that vaccine bump, Conservatives have stayed above, despite many stories in the news you would like to think had got through to the average member of the public and made them go, maybe these guys don't have my best interests at heart. But despite that, if you look at the picture of the polls, it is very generally in favour of the Conservatives. And like in June, I don't know what's going on in June now, I have to think back, but in June it was 43% toward the Conservatives, 33% to Labour. So yeah, a bit of a change down to November, slowly coming down again, kind of more to normality where the two main parties are quite close. Lib Dems have gone up a tiny bit, which is, there tends to be a bit of a interplay between the Lib Dems and the Conservatives. There are people who are kind of on the left side of the Conservatives will fall into the Lib Dems, and you do see a bit of shift there. So the fact that Lib Dems have gone up a bit maybe explains a bit of the loss of the Conservatives, but not a massive amount, I guess. Labour and Conservatives quite close together. But as we go through November, oh no, what's this? The Conservatives, they start to drop. 37, Labour goes up to 36. And then I think it's November 22nd, neck and neck in the polls, 37% for both of them. Again, this is an average of all the polls, so it's not exactly 37%, but essentially that's how we always look at things. And then as we continue down into December, oh, what's that? Labour have a 4 percentage point lead. So I think we need to discuss what happened in the few weeks we've been away, because a lot has happened. It has been it's almost felt like Brexit all over again. It's been a roller coaster of news with just new stuff coming out over and over again. And honestly, in any other, as we've said several times throughout our episodes in the last few years, this would have taken down any other previous government very quickly, I feel. So I think we need to probably touch on why this hasn't quite yet, but still, yeah, it's bad. So yeah, we're just going to barrel on into a set of headlines and we're going to take them as we find them and try and give you a timeline of what's happened and our thoughts on that. So first headline, on November 18th from The Telegraph, I crashed the car over Patterson, admits PM. What's that about, Rob?
Yeah, so this was a scandal that was sort of breaking by the time you were editing the last podcast. The last podcast that came out was on the Chancellor and his budget statement. And rumbling on the background was this Owen Patterson case. So to give a very brief overview, because it is worth sort of just saying what went on. Owen Patterson was an MP, but he was also a lobbyist for a company called Randox, which is not illegal under the rules. MPs are allowed to have multiple jobs and they're allowed to be lobbyists. However, you've got to be very defined in when you are doing your job as a lobbyist and when you are an MP. And for Owen Patterson, it appeared that the lines blurred slightly. So, for example, in his role, he met with the Food Standards Agency and the Department for International Development a number of times in his role as an MP, but appeared to be lobbying on the interest for Randox at the same time. Also, he said to have used sort of parliamentary office and his parliamentary office and stationery sort of headed with the fact that he's an MP when he was doing this consultancy work, which is seen as very bad. Essentially, you can have two jobs and that's fine, but you can't use your influence as an MP to kind of blur those lines, because if you do, that's when the Standards Committee has to step in. And that's what they've done for Owen Patterson on this occasion. So Owen Patterson is investigated throughout 2020. And it is worth saying that as this investigation is going on, sadly, Owen Patterson's wife, Rose, takes her own life. And this is something that, is clearly very serious. And Owen Patterson is even on record as saying that he felt that the inquiry into that played a major role in his wife's suicide. So it becomes, so that the whole situation comes from one about like rules and regulations to one that's slightly more emotive, particularly when it comes to Owen going up to other Conservative MPs and say, hey, look, I've had this investigation into me. I don't think it's right. It's come at a huge personal cost. I don't think I should be suspended for this issue, because what the committee was proposing they do is suspending him for 6 months. Now, it must be said that suspending MPs for this type of thing is something that happens on a fairly regular basis, but it's a pretty standard, it's how you regulate these things and how you make sure people don't do them in the past. That's what the Standards Committee is there for. And various MPs have had sanctions from like a 2-week suspension to a full month. And if you haven't heard it, I would recommend listening to one of the New Statesman podcasts where they get I think it's Chris Bryant, the Labour MP who stands and even chairs the Parliamentary Standards Committee, on what he does and his reasons for giving that 6-month suspension to Owen Patterson. And one of the biggest reasons he said for the length of that suspension was that Mr. Patterson said he would not hesitate to act in the same way if confronted with new information about serious harms or wrongdoing requiring urgent remedy. Basically, he said, I know you've caught me out, but I don't think I've done anything wrong, and I'd do it again, which the Standards Committee quite clearly wasn't very happy with and said, right, we've got to step in and do something here. So that suspension goes ahead. That is from an independent committee, and these things aren't usually voted on. The whole point of those committees are that they are made up from MPs of all sides of the House, pretty proportionally to the current state of the Commons. That's how most committees work. And their ruling is dealt with, and people go away and they accept it. What happened in this case is Owen Patterson lobbied a few of his friends within the Conservative Party who started to get a motion together to try and overturn this decision and make sure that he didn't have that 6-month suspension. More importantly, this wasn't just sort of like a group of 30 Tory MPs who put a motion forward and then the motion would never get any further in the House. It appeared that this motion had the backing of the Prime Minister and the Conservative Party. That means it has the momentum to actually be overturned in Parliament. The Conservatives have a 70-seat majority. If everybody in the Conservative Party is whipped to vote a certain way on that motion, then they can overturn it. And that's pretty much what happened. The vote in the Commons went in Owen Patterson's favour from 248 votes to 231. So the vote was passed, but I feel like the backlash, not only from like the Labour Party and the SNP, the people who you would expect to oppose this, was like they were always going to be against it, clearly, but from many significant people in the media. You've got newspapers like the Daily Mail and the Daily Express certainly taking it back and saying, hey, we think that the government has overstepped its powers here. Because essentially what they were doing, or the precedent that it set, was that if you are an MP for a party that is in the majority in the House of Commons, the rules don't apply to you. We can just vote on it and overturn it if we disagree with the decisions of these independent committees, which is a very bad look for the government and cause widespread allegations of corruption within the Conservative Party. At the same time this was going on, Boris Johnson was trying to get a climate deal through with the COP, which I believe that we touched on last time we were on this podcast. That was it was meant to be one of the big climate conferences, and on the world stage, the Prime Minister was forced to go up and say the UK is not a corrupt country. So I feel that the fact that it got to that level showed how deeply the scandal was affecting people. And I don't know about you, but it's one of the few things where I think wherever you are on the political spectrum, all of a sudden everybody sort of stood up and went, that seems pretty dodgy and pretty wrong.
Yeah, I don't think that there's often kind of, I think we've touched on maybe previously that the BBC has to kind of present both sides of the issue, and sometimes this makes no sense. For example, climate change, where there are no two sides, there is one side. And here it was clear that it was just like, this is bad, guys. There wasn't like, I'm sure maybe on one of like the side shows that I don't really watch, there could have been a talking head being like, oh, I don't think it's that bad, from some random Conservative that I don't know. But it was generally seen as bad.
Yeah, totally. And I think the fact that the government U-turned the next day pretty much shows how bad they felt it was and how bad a look it was. But it made people worry. It made people question Boris Johnson's judgment because, as I said, this was a move that it wasn't just sort of 30 rogue Conservative MPs who wanted to support their friend who was going through a bad time. It was the whole party that had been forced into this issue. And even Jacob Rees-Mogg, the leader of the House, when he was forced to retract this, essentially said something along the lines of, we conflated a personal issue with a larger issue, and if we're going to deal with this in the future, we need to make sure that we separate the two cases. We can't just say we'll always vote against the Parliamentary Standards Committee, because then that leaves you open to allegations of corruption. We should have focused more on this one case and that one, which even as I say it, I'm not believing his argument. I don't think it's a particularly convincing one, but that's how they tried to wriggle out of that situation. So it's an incredibly bad look for the Prime Minister, all of this, and it starts to get people, it adds on to this. We've talked in the past about like Conservative sleaze, and you mentioned like various other scandals that have happened in the past, like Wallpapergate, but those have come to nothing and haven't really hit home with the public. So I think it hit a little bit differently. So the first time it was an issue that hit, every paper of every creed, from the Daily Mail to the Daily Mirror. All of them are saying, hold up, this is an issue where we don't want a government of any party who's in power that can overturn the standards of that committee, one that is meant to act as a balance on the power of the Prime Minister and of the leading party. So that was seen as, everybody can get behind that. Secondly, it highlighted another issue within Parliament that threatened to sort of snowball into something akin to the parliamentary expenses case that did a great deal of damage for people's trust in politicians and how they saw them. This one was the issue of second jobs. So, a lot of people think that their MP is just their MP and that would be a full-time job. You'd think with all the things they got to do, casework, etc., going to Westminster and back to their constituencies, that they would have enough on their plate to not really manage a second job. So it was eye-opening to see that some MPs, not ministers in some cases, but, pretty high up. The most high up, I think, was Sir Geoffrey Cox, who was the Justice Secretary under Theresa May, and you might remember him reading those sort of like big Brexit speeches in the House of Commons. It was revealed that he was a lawyer in his spare time, or maybe not so much in his spare time, because he was caught on Zoom meetings, because everything happened over Zoom over COVID. So there's a bit more of a paper, I don't know if paper trail is the right word, but there's more evidence there that he was working as a lawyer in his office whilst also serving as an MP, which you're definitely not allowed to do. And they knew he was working in his MP's office because the bell goes and he says, oh, I've got to go and vote. Or, I'm very sorry, I'll have to stop this meeting to go and vote, and I'll pop back on and I'll deal with your lawyering case in a minute. It was also revealed that this MP was given special dispensation to work remotely and vote remotely, and he wasn't doing it from like home where he was, or his own constituency. I believe he was doing it from the Cayman Islands, which is, again, a very bad look and stinks of corruption or bad things happening within Westminster. I mean, there are lots of MPs who have second jobs, and it wasn't just Conservatives who have been called up for their second jobs. However, it must be said the majority of those affected were Conservatives who were running up. So again, this is more bad news for Boris Johnson, more apparent sleaze for the Conservative Party. And yeah, it was just another one of those things that could have easily got out of hand. Boris Johnson did agree to vote on new rules restricting what second jobs that the MPs can have, which might have brushed that under the carpet slightly, but as we're going to see, this was that scandal might have gone away, but only because it was replaced by more scandals that were yet to come.
I mean, to paraphrase Smash Mouth, the scandals start coming and they don't stop coming. So let's move on into the next headline. So our second headline, which was only a day later on November 19th, Betrayal of the North. Fury over delayed and downgraded rail plans, from The Guardian. What's that about, Rob? I mean, it should be obvious, I hope, to people in the UK, but I'm sure there are people outside the UK who do not know the words HS2 that we've touched on before.
Yeah, so this is sort of like a scandal over Prime Minister's trust. Can you trust him? Or at least that's how Labour would frame it. And I would point people towards, if we have them in the show notes, I've left a link there to Prime Minister's questions, which preceded all of this and is quite a good barrier between these two stories. That Prime Minister's questions is dominated by, hey, you haven't done enough on MP second jobs, and is a pretty poor showing for the Prime Minister in total. You should probably never get into an open fight with the Speaker of the House of Commons, and the Prime Minister managed to do that with the Speaker shouting at him, you might be Prime Minister of this country, but in this house, I make the rules and you will follow them, or something to that effect, which was show Boris Johnson on the back foot. But the other points that were put by Keir Starmer was, hello, Mr. Prime Minister, you in your manifesto said that you would have a full HS2, a high-speed rail that runs from Birmingham to Leeds on an eastern leg. Tomorrow, you're going to reveal what those plans are. Can you confirm to the House that you're going to build the entire eastern leg of HS2? To which the Prime Minister said, Keir Starmer, you'll have to wait till tomorrow. The plan's going to be amazing. Which everybody kind of took to mean, you've obviously broke your promise there, mate, but you can't lie in the House of Commons. That's why you're not addressing the question. And surprise, surprise, when it came out the next day, that leg of HS2 had been scrapped. So, HS2 is a controversial subject in of itself. It's something that people have been protesting against, and Boris Johnson has sometimes been called a hypocrite because sometimes he would protest it if he's going through his constituency, or sometimes not. Now he's Prime Minister because it's needed for business. So it's certainly not a simple issue. But the way Labour were able to frame it and the way that it damages Boris Johnson is that Boris Johnson had put this as a manifesto promise, particularly to the North, saying the reason we are doing this is because it will help level up and boost businesses in the North. This is why we're doing it. We're going to make it more profitable. We've got to make sure that London is at the heart of all economic interest in the country. If we spread it out and we get these high-speed railway lines to Manchester and Leeds, then the whole country will benefit. And that was seen as a reason why some of those red wall voters we've been talking about, those people who crucially flipped from Labour to Conservative in the 2019 election and helped Boris Johnson get his 70-seat majority, those are the ones that Boris Johnson really has to keep pleasing if he wants to make sure when you get to the next general election, you keep them. This issue, going back on his word, going back on a manifesto promise, and one that obviously damages economic activity in the North, that's where Labour can start to get to him and basically say, look, you may have voted, talking directly to people in those red wall seats, you may have voted Conservative in 2019 because you thought they were going to be, benefit you. Look, actually, Boris Johnson is lying to you. He's breaking your promises. You've been hoodwinked. Maybe you should come back to Labour. We would never do that to you. Why have you abandoned us? Come back to Labour. The Conservatives are just the same old Conservatives. Boris Johnson just pulled the wool over your eyes. So, yeah, that's why this headline kind of hits a bit better and kind of shows I think it shows a new tactic from Labour as well, rather than just saying that, Boris Johnson is lying to you. The specific words that we use is like, Boris Johnson cannot be trusted and he's breaking promises in the North. Everything is framed through the North because Labour are trying to get those Northern voters back. And they know that that's where they're most likely to get a swing from, people who voted Conservative in 2019. They're hoping that they can get them back to Labour as soon as possible.
If you choose to change your vote, it's because you expect to see a difference, right? And that was the promise made, that you will have, levelling up in the North, all of these things were promised. And if you don't see that change within the time of the duration of a term of government, then presumably it's easier to flip you back to your previous voting habits. You go, well, actually, I thought I'd have a change over here with even if essentially the Conservatives are no change, you might be able to be like, well, might as well go back to Labour because it's what I always voted for, kind of thing. But if you can specifically be like, well, they completely lied to you, then yeah, you can see where that would switch people back to their old voting habit. And as we said before, red wall seats, they used to be the thing Labour could just trust in. So they need to get those back if they want to, rely on the old methods anyway. So I've just looked ahead into the document and seen the next headline. So we've had headline 1, I guess, kind of corruption. Headline 2, outright lying. And headline 3, bizarre. So a Peppa pig's ear from the Metro on November 22nd. What's that about, Rob?
Yeah, so, okay, the Prime Minister's had a rough week up until now, all right? He's had scandal upon scandal, and it's his job to go up north to the CBI conference and talk to them a bit and basically say how well businesses is going to do there and essentially how the government's levelling up plan is going to benefit that part of the country. That was the idea anyway, and most people were thinking that this speech might be dominated by him rebuffing those, that lack of a high-speed rail line in the north, which they think many business leaders up there would have been concerned about. However, the speech kind of descends into farce very quickly. There's a moment where Boris Johnson makes the sound of a race car, which is, I don't know, that's probably the least of his problems in this speech. It's funny, it's a Boris Johnson moment. We always remember him talking about whiff waff. It's an ad lib, right? And might have been one of the top moments that people would watch and go, that's typical Boris, ad-libbing there, but isn't he funny? The next bit is less funny. He loses his place in the speech for a good 30 seconds of dead air while he flips through his papers and just says, I would argue too many times, the words, forgive me. Yeah, it's toe curling. I was seeing on Twitter and in the media people saying that if you are a prime minister and you go to a speech, you'll have those notes prepared, but you should have at least read the brief and know where you're going. You shouldn't be so reliant on those notes. To have him have a big moment like this where he loses his place entirely and doesn't know his next point maybe highlights that this is a prime minister who is underprepared or has other things, going on as a distraction. So this was a very awkward moment, and it was starting to get akin to those awful Theresa May moments. Remember her Conservative Party conference speech where she lost her voice and she got presented with a P45 and the letters behind her were falling off. I mean, that was a bad look, but I would say that at least Theresa May was prepared for that speech. It was her body and the set behind her that let her down on that occasion by not giving her the voice to speak on that occasion. This just appeared to be, underpreparedness or incompetence from the Prime Minister, which is a worse look. And then the third thing, which is where we get the headline from, he goes on a bizarre tangent where he suddenly kind of pauses the speech and says to a room of northern businessmen, have you been to Peppa Pig World, which is a theme park attraction sort of in the south. Very unlikely that any of these northern business leaders would have gone to Peppa Pig World. He then goes on for about 2 minutes explaining how Peppa Pig World is a good example of a society that he'd want to create and is very much paraphrasing, maybe maybe Boris Johnson is happier that I'm paraphrasing in this way rather than getting you to hear his own words. But essentially that Peppa Pig is something that shows great ingenuity and is a £6 billion asset to the country and wouldn't have come from the mind of a Whitehall civil servant. We need ingenuity in business to make money. I think that was his point. In there was also a dig at the BBC that the BBC had rejected Peppa Pig, a thing that is demonstrably false by the fact that the BBC said they've never been approached with Peppa Pig and offered it as a show, so they couldn't reject it. But still, I hope you're getting from my response that this is a subject matter that probably has no place within a serious meeting to northern business leaders and led to one ITV journalist asking Boris Johnson just one simple question after the speech: are you okay? Which I don't know about you, but that had a very David Tennant, Doctor Who, doesn't she look tired vibe. Yeah? It was. Did you see the speech and the reaction to it as well?
Yeah, no, it was. I don't think I've seen the speech in full. I've seen the clips that were shared when making the point. But I think I may be wrong, but I'm pretty certain they played the bit of silence. He said, where he was just saying, "Oh, forgive me," in full on what was Brexit Cast and is now Newscast. So they just played that in full to show you how uncomfortably long it was. And it was like, oh dear. And yeah, it very much, it's one of those things where it's like you say, are you okay? It's like, is he up to the job? Is the question that is drawn from this. And I'm sure Boris has done other weird things before, but this was particularly strange. It does kind of stand out as I appreciate he's running back and forth between lots of things. As we now know, his wife was pregnant at the time as well. So, I'm sure there's lots going on in his life. He is Prime Minister, but also your job is kind of to check presumably at some point he had to travel to this event during which he could have been briefed on the thing he was about to read out. And, there's all this stuff in place to deal with the fact that politicians are running about between X, Y, and Z all the time. So, yeah. Weird overall.
Yeah, you might be able to, as a prime minister, you might not be able to deal with like the scandals that are going to come up, but you should be able to do like your day to day, your bread and butter. And a speech for Boris Johnson should be what he's good at. He's done hundreds of speeches throughout his career. That's what he's known for. It should have been an easy win. And instead it turned into like yet another scandal, a fiasco, something that people were talking about and not seeing the Prime Minister in a good light. And it was one of those first, like, not one of the first cracks, but is just like another crack in the Boris Johnson act, which is, to borrow a line from like Labour that I think has also been, we've talked a lot about like Labour, well, we saw at the start of the programme that Labour has gone up in the polls, and we've argued in the past that Labour's messaging hasn't been particularly effective, or clearly wasn't getting through to people, making them change their minds about Boris Johnson. We've always talked about Boris Johnson as a figure who kind of defies political gravity. He's kind of like a Trump figure in that way. He seemed to be able to do things that other politicians simply couldn't, and get away with it, and maybe even get a bounce as a result. The Labour line right now has been that the act just isn't funny anymore. We've seen this. We've seen the bumbling buffoon trying to like smile and charm his way through it. This Peppa Pig speech at the CBI was almost like a malfunctioning version of Boris Johnson, a stand-up comedian doing all of his old act, and everybody saying, well, I've seen this before, and actually you can't get away with it again. It was that kind of feel anyway. That's what I got from that whole CBI speech, and I think that's why it was just like particularly damaging on this occasion, or had more of an impact than previous Boris faux pas in the past.
Yeah, and I think it's also, as you say, it's in this climate of suddenly like scandal after scandal or issue after issue. It just adds into that overall narrative as well, kind of all the points we're pointing out now. It's not like a blip in a normal week. It's another thing to pile onto the pile of problems he was having. So those headlines there cover some problems Boris was having in November, and we would have normally recorded then, so that's why we want to kind of set the scene. But things died down a bit. He had like a week or so of reprieve before we got this headline on December 5th from the Mirror. Our loved ones died while number 10 partied. And if you're in the UK, I don't think you could have avoided this news. But obviously for our international listeners, we will tell you what's going on here. So Rob, do you want to go ahead on that?
Yeah, so revelations start coming out, particularly from the Daily Mirror, who I must say have had some excellent reporting on this issue, and I think have been quite clever with the way that they've slowly leaked this information out. Essentially, there were stories that there were a Christmas party or Christmas parties within Downing Street last year, the most significant of which being one on December the 18th. That date is very important because that was the date that Tier 4 restrictions or Tier 5 restrictions came in London, which was the order, basically when Boris Johnson had to go up and say, we're very sorry, we've got to go back into lockdown again. You can see loved ones on Christmas Day, but that's it. And in very small groups, we've got to do this to save the NHS. All of that big coronavirus, that second wave of coronavirus legislation that was coming out and us going back into lockdown. At that same time, there were allegations that people within number 10 and within those staff offices had broken social distancing rules and were holding a Christmas party, which clearly, as the emotive headline from the Mirror says there, has a big effect on public confidence in their leader and their ability to follow the rules. It undermines them entirely, doesn't it? I've been talking about Labour slogans, like one of the ones they've banged on about pretty much this entire pandemic, but it's one rule for us and it's another rule for them. This seems to be the ultimate example of it, and particularly when we've now got Christmas coming up again, and people are remembering how bad it was last Christmas, or how odd it was last Christmas, to know that you've got high-profile members of government ignoring those rules made some people feel very betrayed by their own party. And I do recommend that people go to Twitter and look at Ross Atkins, who is a BBC journalist who does these excellent, he does them for pretty much all the scandals, but his reporting on the Christmas party affair and what goes on, he lays out just the facts. that have happened. It is, because it's the BBC, they can just do facts rather than opinions, but the facts laid out in such a way that it appears very damning for the Prime Minister. The weirdest thing about this, and the way that the government responded to these allegations, because they are just allegations at the moment, there's no sort of concrete proof that they happened. The government says that basically that no parties happened and all rules were followed, which I don't know about you, Tom, but to me, that's a very, those two things cannot pass together, right? Either the party didn't happen, therefore there were no rules to be broken in the first place because it never happened, or the party did happen, but they followed the rules. Those statements that were coming out from Number 10 and was the line that ministers had to parrot for a week afterwards just made people very suspicious, I think, about what actually happened within Number 10 at this time.
It sounded weird. And it's we're building up a picture here of a government that has lied, has been caught lying during PMQs. And, I don't think this is a surprise to anyone who's been following Conservative Party recently at all. But saying something and then rolling back on it immediately to try and deal with the press has been a kind of Boris Johnson strategy that does not seem to really work. And that's been a thing we touched on last year. We had the fact that last year we had a similar episode to this where we were just here's all the Conservative scandals from this year, makes you go, when you hear something like that, you're like, well, we're going to find out in a week that that's a lie, right? I don't think many people were watching that going, oh yeah, believe that 100%. And then, maybe we should move on into headline number 5 to see what happened next. So the next headline on December 8th from the Daily Mail, a sick joke. So what revelation did we have then? Her face is all over the particular issue in a weird angle because it's like a video of a video, right? It's not a proper screen grab, but they've actually managed to make quite a good picture of from it, even though it's at a weird angle. So what did we find out on Wednesday?
So we find out that Allegra Stratton, who was employed to be essentially the UK's press secretary, the role that, how in the USA, Biden will have a press secretary that takes those press conferences. Trump had Sean Spicer, probably one of the most famous ones under his career, somebody who, when the government has an issue, the Prime Minister doesn't have to go out. You'll get your spokesperson to go out for you and they'll deal with the press. Allegra Stratton was brought in last year, and you may remember that the government made a big blue room with lots of flags in for this event. It cost £2.6 million that was meant to host these occasions. On December last year, there's a bunch of Number 10 insiders and Allegra Stratton up on the podium who are doing a practice run, basically saying, what would you do if a journalist said X or Y? And one of the questions that was posed saying, what have you got to say about the allegations that there was a Christmas party within Number 10? And Allegra Stratton, the press secretary at the time, giggles and basically says, something along the lines of, was it a party? Oh, no, I think it was just a cheese and wine, maybe nibbles. And suggests that, she left before the party started. Essentially taking, a very light-hearted approach to this whole situation, but kind of confirming on camera what we already thought we knew, that there was a Christmas party within Downing Street, and a number of very influential Number 10 insiders knew about the event as well. Because in that room, not only have you got the press secretary, who will be very close to Boris Johnson, you've got his director of communications as well, you've got other members of his internal team all laughing and joking about the fact they've had a party, whereas the Mirror said on that headline just days before, our loved ones died while Number 10 partied. And to see them sort of laughing and taking it as a sick joke, as the Daily Mail has said, really started to do damage to Boris Johnson and his credibility and, what he knew about the party. Basically, tarnishing it and saying, hey, you don't seem to be taking your own COVID rules seriously. As a result of this, there was a statement made from the Prime Minister during Prime Minister's questions, which was, the worst type of apology you can get is where somebody says, you know what, I'm sorry if you were offended, because he's like, you're not really sorry, are you, about what you said? The thing that Boris Johnson said here was, I'm sorry that the video gave an impression that we had a party. What I'm going to do, because I take these issues seriously and I'm very sorry about the impression this video gives, is I'm going to do a big inquiry into if there was a party in my house on December 18th. And through questioning from Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister maybe accidentally commits to allowing them to investigate more parties that might have happened around the time, because there are stories coming out now that it wasn't just the December 18th party, that there were other various parties happening in different departments. Again, super bad look for the government. The fact that half of this PMQs was taken up by people asking him about the party and him just having the same boilerplate response looks really bad. It's clearly an issue that he's going to be unable to move away from for quite some time. And this is further compounded, I guess, by the news that is going to break that evening of PMQs, which will make his messaging and this sort of like supposed hypocrisy within government even more difficult.
It's kind of amazing how thick and fast this has all come, because it was like, as a scandal, we have that first, I think it was December 2nd is the first video that was posted according to the BBC thread. And then this was kind of unraveling. And I was on holiday during this, and obviously I was still hearing about it, but it was like every day something's hitting. And then it very much is December 8th, 9th, 10th, bang, bang, bang. So we've just had December 8th, which was a sick joke. The Sun on December 9th says, "Do as I say, not as I Christmas do," with possibly one of the worst Photoshops ever. Again, a Photoshopped Boris Johnson as the Grinch, which is just weird and atrocious, but I guess it grabs the attention. And I'm slightly sad I've been beaten to this observation by TikTok, but this is actually the first time I've seen this cover. But it has one rule for them in like the slightly smaller text, which is interesting to see the Sun using Labour's messaging.
Yeah, I think it shows that it's getting through. That Labour message is becoming more of a big message for the country. But yeah, so this is the Sun reacting to the news on the night before, essentially. So all of that, the headlines are always kind of like a day out of sync. So the news broke on that day of PMQs afterwards, on December 8th. So we've had this news rumbling on in the background for a while that there is a new variant, the Omicron variant, that has come from South Africa, that the government and government scientists think is a potential threat to our current coronavirus situation. It appears, at least, that this variant is highly transmissible, and the news from that conference was that although we don't think that there is any increase in sort of the severity of the effect of this variant compared to other COVID variants that we've had in the past, the ability for it to spread particularly quickly presents a very real risk of hospitals being overwhelmed during the Christmas period and into January if action isn't taken now. So Boris Johnson decided that there would be new measures brought forward to try and tackle this. No lockdown measures, but a work from home order, as well as essentially vaccine passports to be used at venues such as football matches, nightclubs, places where people are mingling and in very close contact. And if you're unable to present a vaccine passport, then you at least need to provide proof of a negative test to get into those venues. Now, we've been talking a lot about the Christmas party story and how that affects people who have clearly been, hit very hard by COVID and wanted to follow the rules and felt that they had been betrayed by a government that wasn't willing to follow its own rules. Now Boris Johnson has to go and say, look, we may not have followed the rules, but we really need to follow the rules this time or else we'll overwhelm the NHS. Which, one, makes him look like a massive hypocrite, which is what that Sun headline is doing. Two, it angers a lot of people who aren't yet quite as angry with the Prime Minister, which is those who believe COVID regulations have been too steep, those who are against lockdowns in total. They're the ones who, Boris Johnson promised there would never be another lockdown. People who thought we were getting out of this, all of a sudden he's asking us to do it again, particularly very close to Christmas. And there's a significant amount of about 40 backbench MPs who are very much against this kind of legislation going through. Particularly, they seem to be against vaccine passports, which they see as an intrusion on people's liberty. Vaccine passports have always been seen a step too far for those people who are worried that the COVID rules tend to overstep what the government can actually do. And if you are, for example, a Daily Telegraph reader, a paper that is very much against these like rules going on, the Daily Telegraph might not have been so bothered about a Christmas party. They might have felt that, oh, you should have had a Christmas party last year anyway, because we don't really care about these rules. They're more angry about Boris, about him enforcing them this time round. So where you've got, whereas before all these scandals have kind of been like hitting his support from the left, having to go to plan B is where he's now being hit with threats from the right and other people who may have been conservatives before, saying, I don't want to support a party who promised me that they wouldn't put these rules in again, and now they're being forced to do so. So yeah, you've got very suddenly within the space of a week a cocktail of scandals and stories that are hitting Boris Johnson from both sides and undermining his support. And I think that's where you can start to see the polls that we mentioned earlier going from kind of like level pegging with Labour to Labour suddenly taking that lead over the Conservatives as more people drain away from them.
I just want to issue a short clarification on what you said earlier. The Omicron variant did not necessarily come from South Africa. It was merely detected there first because they have really, really good detection services for viruses. So that's just one thing I want to state so that people don't think we think that. And the other thing is, like, as you say, yeah, it's this. It puts you in this kind of weird. Not a catch-22. So there are some people who don't follow the guidance anyway, and they're just, this is more fuel on the fire for them. And now Boris has to stand up, as you say, and say, look, I really need to stay inside. But the problem is he's lost all credibility because of these parties. And then, but I think the problem is there are people like us who are already following the rules and will follow the rules, no matter what we think about them. To be clear, when I say that, I think the rules are important and we should follow them. But, the fact that they're coming from Boris seems a bit rich. For all the stuff we've stated, like if he's not going to follow his own rules and it's one rule for them and another one for us. To kind of paraphrase a comedian I saw the other day saying, oh, Boris, I don't want to follow any of your rules except, for getting vaccinated and wearing a mask and the other things that I think I should do, which is kind of this weird position we're in where it's like, well, it's not like I stopped, I was wearing a mask when I didn't have to because it was the sensible thing to do. So I think that's the problem is like for people who have been in the situation of like sticking to the rules and, I'm sure someone would say, oh, maybe, you only follow the rules you're told to. You don't need to wear a mask when you're told not to. But also like, it just seemed weird. Like, especially over the summer when we started having things like weddings, I was like, I'm not comfortable not wearing a mask in a church. Sorry, regardless of what the rules say. And if people are annoyed at me, they'll have to be annoyed at me because I'd rather they don't die. I think that's the kind of situation where I've been at. And, maybe I've been over cautious in certain situations, but I'd rather be over cautious than not, basically. But yeah, it is for the person who may be less inclined to follow the rules anyway, hearing Boris say it, I don't see how he has any credibility anymore. And speaking of credibility, we have one more headline for you from the 10th of December. Which is Friday, which is from the Daily Mirror. Another day, another lie. Yeah,
to kind of top off Boris's week as it happened early on the day after you've got those Plan B restrictions set to come in. The Electoral Standards Committee got involved and talked about the Prime Minister's flat refurbishment, which is something that we've talked about in the past. And the Prime Minister, we thought, had kind of been able to weasel out of that. There was an inquiry by a man called... It was Lord Geit, who essentially came out and said, look, we don't think Boris Johnson has broken any rules here. What turned out to be the case was that not only did Boris Johnson get fined, or essentially his department get fined for having seen to break rules about how that flat refurbishment was funded, there was also evidence that a WhatsApp message was sent by the Prime Minister to Lord Brownslow, who was the one who was funding the refurbishment at a time where Lord Geit believed that there had been no contact. The Prime Minister said, "Hey, I didn't know where any of this money had come from." So there are again allegations that the Prime Minister had lied to a person doing the independent review of his affairs, which is a very bad look. And particularly if he's lied there, did he lie in Parliament, which is a big deal, because particularly when you've got something. A lot of people can talk about prime ministers or MPs lying in Parliament or under PMQs as something that happens. Oh, I bet they do it every other week. Those rapscallion politicians are all as corrupt as each other. But it's actually like a big offence to properly lie. It's something you would be expected to resign for if you have lied to the House in a sort of like a demonstrable way. If it was found out that you definitely knew about something and you misled the House as Prime Minister, that's a big dent in your credibility. There were worries, or there were rumblings even from the Daily Telegraph, that the Lord who had conducted this investigation might resign in his role, essentially because he felt that he'd been lied to. He hasn't done that, but he does want Boris Johnson to explain himself a little bit more. And it's just this was the day that information was revealed, that he was going to that flat refurbishment was wrong and had been proven to be wrong, and they would be fined for it, that he may have lied to an independent investigator, that he wanted to try and get him to clear him of all charges before then. And on that day, Carrie Johnson had her second child, which meant that Boris Johnson has kind of disappeared from public view because he's now spending time away from Parliament to be with his family and with his newborn child. But people did feel like it was said, and I was listening to a newscast, they were basically saying that you couldn't make this up. If somebody gave you a script for the events of the last week and said, hey, turn this into political drama, it would be considered too far-fetched. And I believe even Andrew Marr this morning has said that it wouldn't be believable as a story with Boris Johnson at the centre of it, because you've got to have a believable main character. Just Boris Johnson doesn't really fit that criteria.
You kind of feel like maybe the dam is broken in some way, because you feel like maybe some people, like this story coming out now, like people are like, well, we might as well try and... People who may have not wanted to reveal things about the Prime Minister might be like, let's reveal this now because everyone's dunking on the Prime Minister. And you do wonder how long he can survive. So he said he's going to take some time off because he has a new child, which, is a reasonable thing for anyone to do. Although, as you say, the timing is a bit suspect. I mean, the fact that they have a child is, a thing that's happened. Like, but like the revealing of that, they could have waited a day, but they obviously revealed the story at that point. But obviously he's going to take a break for an unspecified period of time. Don't know how that'll affect the poll numbers, not having him in the headlines. But I feel like there's, I get the impression there's probably more things to come out if there's stuff like this coming out now. I wouldn't be surprised if there's more stuff to come out. This is one of those things where if someone has been lying to the public a lot and there are stories about them, as those stories start to come out and people realize, oh, well, those people are just publishing their stories, then and it's fine and not getting in trouble, essentially, more of those stories can come out. So I think we probably have to watch this space on Boris Johnson scandals. I'm sure there are more to come to light. And that's the thing. You shouldn't be sat there after a scandal being like, well, I'm sure this is one of many. So that's probably not good for Boris either. And it can probably stay in the news in the run up to Christmas, which is not going to help his polling numbers anymore. We always wondered when it would catch up with him, I guess. And this seems like it's finally catching up with him, fingers crossed.
I think it's very important to say that Boris Johnson is still very much like the Prime Minister. There is no... a lot of people would say like Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss would be the people in waiting to take over, but we haven't had people submit letters to the 1922 committee. It hasn't got to like Theresa May levels of we can't function this government anymore. But clearly, this is the first time that the poll numbers have taken a big dip, and public trust in Boris Johnson is at an all-time low when you really want your trust in the Prime Minister to be at an all-time high, particularly when he's asking you to follow COVID rules for people's safety. So that's a big worry for people in government at the moment. Nick Robinson, who is on BBC Radio 4 and is one of the chief political correspondents there, tweeted something out basically saying that he'd interviewed 2 Conservative ministers and asked them about the party and their parties, and the response was sort of like, asked their opinion on it. There was a very pregnant pause before going on to that. None of these people were stepping forward to defend Boris Johnson. They were more considering their own position, which is very dangerous for a Prime Minister, because essentially if you haven't got members of your cabinet, if you haven't got MPs willing to step forward and defend you, then what else are they willing not to do, to not support your premiership as a leader? Once again, like you said, I mentioned earlier how I think the Daily Mirror has been quite smart about the way they've leaked information slowly about these parties. It started at the start of December, and today we've had the story that is all over the front pages as we record this is an image of Boris Johnson on a screen giving a Christmas quiz to a Christmas party that happened on December 15th, flanked by two people, one in a Father Christmas hat, the other in with a tinsel tie, which kind of makes you believe that, Boris Johnson's line about this, or his new line, has been, well, there may have been parties, but I think they covered COVID rules, but I'll investigate it. But I had no idea about the parties. People reported to me and told me there were no parties. Mate, we've got a picture of you giving a Christmas quiz now to a party that's clearly not work related. You must have known what's going on. If that's another lie he's been caught up in, and maybe that's where the damage is being done. He's being caught in his own lies and thinking that he can cover it up, and slowly, like even this flat refurbishment, that's a long tail on that, but eventually it appears that one of his lies about when he knew about the flat refurbishment has caught up with him, and they all seem to be spilling out at the same time. And the fact that he's losing trust not only from like people going to Labour but also from those within his party, that's where it gets really dangerous. Maybe the only respite for the Prime Minister is that I don't know if he's going to do Prime Minister's questions this week or if he'll be spending more time with his new child. There were rumblings that people were thinking about closing Parliament a week early, so they usually break for Christmas anyway, but they would break early just to make sure that there wasn't another PMQs before Christmas. Maybe the only way Johnson can survive this is hoping that we get distracted by Christmas, which is like less than 2 weeks away now. And by the time it's January, we might have forgotten about all of this, or at least he will have had a couple of weeks where there isn't a constant scandal breaking. But I think the problem with this Christmas party scandal is that everybody wants to have Christmas parties at the moment. It's, it's got Christmas in the headline, so Christmas does nothing to distract. If anything, it just points a light more on the Prime Minister and what he's done. So yeah, a dire situation, and the fact that Labour are now ahead in the polls, where the Conservatives appeared to be untouchable for a while, does seem to me at least, show that Boris Johnson is subject to the forces of political gravity, and that they will have to... he's not out the door yet. There's a long way to go, and this might all blow over, but he needs to get a grip before it gets any worse, because if it keeps getting worse, I don't quite see how he gets out of this, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think as you said, like, yes, there have not been letters yet to the 1922 committee, but there are... I just saw a thing saying there's now some of the Theresa May backers, getting ready to like say something. There are definitely rumours now, whereas before I don't think there were any rumours that anyone might be going to the 1922 committee, whereas now there are definitely rumours about people going against, because there's a vote coming up on the new rules as well, so it sounds like people are going to try and vote against that, and so it's being dubbed Operation Revenge by the Theresa May fans. And yeah, there's a lot going on, and Boris May, as you say, he said Boris is the Prime Minister and he's not gone anywhere yet, but there's now the kind of rumblings that we would have expected earlier with another Prime Minister, I guess, and once those rumblings start, it's harder and harder to dismiss them, I think, because that was the problem Theresa May had. There started to be rumblings, and eventually those rumblings turned into a vote of no confidence in her. So yeah, I think he's on the precipice.
It's sort of the opposite problem that you had with Theresa May. People said, oh, she's actually quite competent at the running of things in general. Like, there's none of the incompetence of the Johnson administration, but she was very poor at campaigning, and it was her poor campaigning that led to the Conservatives having a reduced majority, which essentially tied their hands over Brexit and couldn't get anything through. So because she was a bad campaigner, the Conservatives were forced to get rid of her. With Johnson, I think, as we've said throughout our time since he's been Prime Minister, his ruling has been slightly chaotic and some people would argue incompetent at times, but the Conservatives have been able to look at the polls and reassure themselves by saying, well, he might not be running things perfectly, but people still support him. We still think he's an election winner. We've got to get behind this, but we've got to keep behind this bloke, because otherwise he's our ticket to more and more years of Conservative government. Now he's being incompetent and losing in the polls. That's where the ground gets really shaky for him, and that's where the Conservatives will start to feel the ones who are worried about their future and worried about their party's future. The people who didn't like Boris Johnson in the first place now have more ammunition to say, hey, look, not only is he incompetent, he can't win us the next election. Maybe it's time we give him the boot. And that's why it's such a dangerous time for Johnson as well.
Yes, yeah. I guess watch this space for more scandals and where Boris goes from here.
Yeah.
We don't have polls to go into because we started the show with them. So I guess, it's been a roller coaster of a few weeks, and I'm not sure if we're going to do a special in person this year. It's a thing that is hypothetically possible, but the rules are changing so quickly that I don't know what's going on. I would love to still be able to see you in person as is currently planned, but we'll see what happens, I guess. So yeah, maybe one more episode before Christmas or around Christmas. We'll also do our New Year's predictions, but it may not be recorded in person depending on the situation. As always, you can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. You can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at Unparl Podcast. And of course, you can find us on patreon.com/TTSS, where you can support all the shows and the blog at the website. So feel free to throw $1 our way if you are so inclined, and you will get Patreon bonus content like me talking about what it's like not being able to smell and being isolated at home, which is not as bad as it could have been thanks to vaccinations. Other than that, I don't think there's anything else for me to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him.
Bye.
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 Bye bye. Bye 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 bye.
Ooh, festive buys.
Festive buys. Last one before Christmas?
Possibly.
Pretty sure.
We'll see.
Good evening and welcome to the bar. Join Dr. Wilko as he investigates the histories of your favourite spirits and your favourite cocktails while mixing you a drink at the bar. The other bars may be closed, but a podcast bar will always remain open.